Hello and welcome to Advanced Bunker Texturing. This is Chris, CE Sim Golf. I think this is probably the series people have been asking for the most. I will start with a disclaimer. I am not an expert on UV mapping, which is what we're going to be using to do this. I just happen to be fairly good artistically in Photoshop. So I know how to make this work. There are probably people out there who can teach you the tech side of things or find a better workflow, but here's how I'm working on it. What's required to figure out this? Have you done everything else to create your meshes? Inkscape layout done, terrain shaping and digging is done, your Blender work is done, and did you do any of that advanced modeling that the first series I showed? Yes, you could go back and do these UV maps and this texture painting pretty much any time. You can redo it after doing more of these jobs. It would just be much easier if you did it as kind of your last step. But I will touch base later on how to just quickly redo it as well. So what do you need to know for knowledge? You really need to be comfortable in some sort of graphics program. I'm using Photoshop, a rather old version of it, but a pretty good software package for this. Probably the industry standard de facto art package for this kind of thing. A lot of people use free software. There are others out there. It should work in anything that can create a texture. But you need to be very familiar with whatever you're using and be willing to experiment and take your time and feel artistic. UV mapping in Blender is going to be similar to how you would do a custom 3D object. So if you've done any other kind of 3D object builds, you're probably going to be better at this than me right now, because while I can model pretty well, I have not done much with UV mapping and custom things like clubhouses and other objects. This will probably be much easier than that, other than the creating your own texture in Photoshop, not just using what you find somewhere on the internet. More than anything, this is just going to take time, and the quality of your finished product is all going to be about your artistic eye and just your abilities to get the look you're going for. The best way to do this, to start this, would be to create a multiple Photoshop, that's what a PSD file is, base files that have where you gather reference images and things that you want to use to rough up and naturalize your bunkers, whether that's pictures of footprints or rake lines, leaves, sticks, just kind of blended textures. And if you have that kind of already set up, it won't take as long to do each one. Just experiment. That's the name of the game. So what are we doing? UV mapping is kind of like taking a photograph or telling the software how to apply the photograph, the texture, to an object. The meshes are basically flat, and they're textured with tiling textures by default. That means that the texture repeats. If you have a good one, you won't notice, but sometimes you can really see that. We're going to export the shape of the bunker as a flat outline and then paint the entire bunker in one texture image file, which means that the texture file is going to be larger in dimensions. And if you did this to every bunker, despite taking many hours to do, might severely affect your performance depending on the size of your textures. So I'm only doing this on probably 6 or 8, maybe 10 bunkers tops on my course, just to add a little flair here and there and show off. UV unwrapping tells the software how we're going to position that texture. It gives the bunkers a lived-in look, and we're just going to be adding roughed up things. Mostly we're adding the things that we don't want to see when we're on a course, if we're golfing. But inevitably we will see these things, and so why wouldn't we see them on a fake course? This is going to mostly override the sat shader, especially when you're up close. So if you're using sat shaders to create some darker areas at the bottom where maybe it's wet, or whatever you're doing with the sat shader, you're going to want to kind of copy that effect, paint that into this texture, because you won't really see any of that through. You can even get nice blends and lips with this texture. Really, the sky's the limit. So we could forego the lip geometry and separate, and we could just paint the lip right onto the texture. But it can be difficult to find the right techniques for realism. That's probably the hardest part, is just being frustrated with expecting one thing and trying to make it work, whether it's the resolutions we're using, our abilities to paint things, or just finding the right images for kind of the base that we want. Let's take a look at what UV mapping is doing really quick before we move on to the next video. Here's my awesome skills in Photoshop on display already. So we're looking at a cross-section of a sand trap. You've got the rough leading into it. You've got the lip, which is that separate texture on our default bunkers, and then the sand. Now, sand is going to be shaped. The sand traps are, depending on what style, sort of like a bowl, but in general, they're going to be mostly flat at the bottom. The lip is mostly vertical, and the rough leading into it is mostly flat as well, although we've been playing in our other videos with creating some more vertical descent into the bunker, or even having it where that rough kind of, as you remember, came out like that, which gave us grass hanging down like this. So this is challenging to UV map, and what we're going to end up with something that looks like this. Here's a bunker that has rough that's, I've created an overhang like I was talking about. You can see the geometry of it dipping around like that. I took off the 3D grass so we could see it. When 3DG is planted and in effect, you won't notice this horrible texture stretching very much. But this is what happens. Think of it like if you were taking a picture of something, or you laid something on a scanner bed. And on that scanner bed, maybe you rolled the paper into a tube. Well, that part that's starting to roll away from not laying flat, it's going to look really weird and stretched as it's taking a picture of that. So UV mapping for bunkers and rough general terrain is done from straight down, and lip is done from straight facing the lip, because you see in that picture the lip is not stretched. The lip is using a projection from a different direction, right? So that's why it doesn't appear to be stretched. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a new projection of our bunkers from the top down, use that shape to paint our texture. That's the gist of it. It's not as hard as it sounds, especially from a Blender standpoint. It's going to be the Photoshop work that takes your time. So check out the next video and we'll get going. Thanks.